So Paula, thanks so much for doing this. You're a really integral part of the network. Mm-hmm. Primarily really because I think my idea for the network or for this approach came when I went to see a kibosh play, Those You Pass in the Street, and there was a Q&A afterwards. Mm-hmm. And there was one particular woman who was sitting beside me and she was really angry. And it was in the Brian Freely Theatre in South Belfast. So it wasn't a space where I would have anticipated it. Mm-hmm. It's a conventional theatre space. And this woman was just, she was furious. And there was so much emotion there bubbling away in response to that play. And I remember thinking, historians need to be here. Mm-hmm. We need to be here listening to this and trying to record some of the emotion around it all. And so maybe you could just talk about kibosh and the role of it.
Well, theatre's obviously about a communication. It's about a dialogue between people that are standing in front of you and you're in a group of people you've never met before. So you're anonymous. In theory, you're in the dark, and you really won't know the people that are with you. And the work that we do, a very large percentage of it, tries to give voice to those people who are currently not being heard. So it's not that they're silent, it's just we're not listening to them. And a lot of that work deals with how we look at the legacy of conflict. So 90% of our work's based on that. All of the work is original work, it's not living history. Now what that means is that we would gather the stories. So we gather stories, we do interviews, we look at what gaps are in the narrative, we look at whose conversation is not part of that whole debate about conflict. And then we archive those stories, usually with a community partner, and then we give the narratives to a playwright who fictionalises it, so that they put it through a different lens. Now what happens when you do that is you challenge both the person who originally owned the story and those that have never heard it before. And we perform the pieces in theatre spaces and non-theatre spaces because then we can take it into the hearts of communities. And quite often what we find is spaces will tend to be single identity. And quite a lot of our kind of bigotry or sectarianism comes from a fear of the other, a fear of somebody you feel you're not part of that community. And quite often that can be connected to space. And so it's really interesting and spaces have history, particularly single identity spaces, like whether it's a graveyard or a courthouse or a prison or whatever in under God it is, whether it's a community centre in the heart of a community that's single identity. So what's great about that is then we can bring the work right into the hearts of communities, and so barriers to access are not there. But then also when we do it in spaces that are different, people are curious about the space. So the theatre then partly becomes an excuse to see that space, whether it's the inside of a synagogue or a church or as I say, a Republican club or a Loyalist club or wherever it is. But the work is all provocative. And I know we've talked a lot in the network about, you say about the involvement of academia. We work very hard in partnership with academia, and that not only is about archiving the impact of the work, but it's about creating a catalyst for the start of the work. So it's introducing us to the storytellers. It's introducing to the gaps in there, like in the narrative. And the other thing as well is because we're not dealing with absolutes, we're dealing with the moment before somebody puts down a gun. What is that moment? The moment when somebody decides to plant the bomb. Those moments that are like an emotional human action that isn't black and white. It's about absolutely on that moment. What decision is made? The moment pre-peace. The moment when you start a war. Like if we could articulate those or give voice to those, then I think we can really talk about change. We can change the narratives. And so that's the type of work that we do. And it means that academics work with us to start a project, to analyse the process, to view and critique the product, but then also deal with the legacy of it, how you map the methodology, how you then share it at conferences, how you share that and distill it so that it can be shared globally. But with each project that we do, I'm constantly surprised at how audiences are animated by the work. And because I think when you ask somebody, when you, like I suppose, encourage an emotional reaction to something, we find empathy very difficult. You know, like when somebody feels empathetic towards a police officer or a soldier or even a priest or a educator, whatever has caused us that pain, and then you put them in front of somebody and you fictionalise elements of them and you humanise them, how we deal with that is really difficult. So I'm not surprised audiences are emotional and find themselves sharing stuff in a public space that they wouldn't normally share. And audiences are very intelligent, you know. Like I think we underestimate them sometimes. And I think if you get the engagement right and it's quality and it is done with respect to the narrative, I think it's amazing what people do. And but also the other thing is then, you know, because the question that would then come up is then how do you ensure you don't re-traumatise? And in order to do that, we work with community gatekeepers, and it's about trying to consider the right time in which you share a story. Now, the performance that you mentioned there obviously was in a perceived neutral space because it was in a theatre setting. And so somebody chose to go to that at that time. That person made the decision that they wanted to look at the concept of victims and survivors and addressing the legacy of conflict, and they wanted to be in that room. So that surprise that it causes in them, they're amazed at their own emotion and they can't help themselves but go, oh, listen, this is, you know, this is how I feel about it. And anger is a good thing, you know. I think the concept of provocations are good, but when we do it within a community setting, in order to not re-traumatise it, is really important that we have the piece ready to take to a community when they are, in theory, ready to hear it. And I feel very strongly about that, and we work with gatekeepers to do that, but also it means the work needs to be fit to be revived. And so, for example, again, the show you're talking about, we started that in 2014, and I'm actually doing it again this month for a group from Sudan that cannot figure out how they use the arts to deal with the legacy of conflict. How do you give voice to victims and perpetrators in the same piece? How do you put those people together and create those conversations? And I think we've very sophisticated methodology across the art forms as regards how we deal with conflict. Because inevitably, look, it was a 40-year conflict. A lot of us have spent a long time mapping our own personal memories, how we feel about things emotionally, and then it gets to a point where we are in a position to possibly expose some of that and inform the work that we choose to do. But yeah, it's always a privilege to hear people share their stories, you know, and that's basically what we do.
I mean, I suppose the other thing, you know, you talk about victim and perpetrator, but it also seems to me that one of the things Kabosh has been increasingly doing is looking at that legacy in a much broader way. So looking at domestic violence, looking at, you know, this idea that you can have a society where a certain level of violence is normalised, and the idea that that stops at the front door was a terrible fiction. Mm-hmm. And so to address those private spaces as well as the public ones.
Mm-hmm. And there hasn't been enough work done in that field. Like, I think that when we look at the fallout of conflict, it's absolutely overwhelming, from levels of poverty to levels of undereducation to domestic servitude to domestic violence to suicide levels to, like, all of those things that are the fallout of conflict, and also some issues that got kind of hidden because we were dealing with conflict. You know, particularly issues of human rights. I mean, we do a lot of work within LGBTQ plus activism. We've done a lot of work in that field, where there are narratives that were quietened by the extent of war. And I think that every time I do a project, it's that thing I was saying there, that you realise there's another narrative that hasn't been given a voice or hasn't been heard because there's been so many other bigger voices that needed to go to the fore first, you know.
Because this idea of two communities, you know, and even when people say there are more than two communities, they're kind of saying there are people who don't have any religion, and remember there's the Jewish community. They're still thinking in terms of religion. Yeah. Whereas actually, I mean, you've done really great work, I think, with the deaf community. Mm-hmm. And that also, that influenced my work too, and I interviewed people who are deaf for my Sensing the Troubles project. And again, that kind of that non-verbal way of representing an experience is so expressive.
It's incredible. I think also, like when we all work in this field, like we think we're fairly knowledgeable, we think we're fairly political, we think we have an ear to those people that aren't at the table, I suppose. And like I have been involved in sound performances, for years on and off, and some of our work, by its very nature, isn't in accessible spaces because they are either in contested sites that are historical, or else some of the spaces we work with just aren't modern. But the sound work has been incredible. We work with an amazing signer now who does sound performances for us, but also signs post-show discussions, and that's hugely important. But also as well, like members of our deaf community, by the very nature of oppression, are activists, and actually their sense of politics and their sense of injustice. And they also provide us a different lens by looking at our own personal memories. Like I know one of the people that you interviewed grew up very close to me. And so they were growing up through my timeline of the conflict. And yet their experience of it was completely different. And so it made me reassess mine and made me look at there's a different way to tell that same story and to connect with a different group of people. Mm-hmm. And I think that sense of responsibility as an arts activist, I think it's really good to shake it up every so often, and have other voices there.
I mean that sense of responsibility is something that's come up, I think, in terms of not just being able to bring forward other people's stories, the act of listening, being able to hold a space for that person to tell their story and then to represent it. All of those things are a pressure, and we have our own stories that we're bringing to that too. I suppose I'm wondering about the cost of it to you, the weight of it all.
It's balanced with luck, I feel very, very lucky. Like every single project, we work with so many different agencies, and I work with so many people who trust me with their story. And that's kind of like, that's like liquid iron, do you know what I mean? That sorts you out, it really does. Because you there is somebody constantly telling you, what you do is important, what you do is really good, please keep doing it. Like when people say to you, I exist, I've just seen myself on that stage. I breathe. Parents say to us, I can finally explain what it was like to wear a uniform. Or like we did a show, say we toured to kind of regional venues, like somebody takes time after watching a show in Mullabone to send you an email to go, I've been oppressed because I am an older gay man. I have never really expressed how I feel about it. I grew up in the 1970s. If somebody just in that moment feels that they can go the extra step and tell you, then like listen, that kind of keeps me going. But you also do it in bursts, and yeah, it's tough, but you meet some incredible people. People never cease to amaze me. And also, there's too many stories to be told. You haven't the time to be resting. That's the other thing, so.